the thing that I want you to understand is, there are multiple ways to understand what is happening inside of a surah. The surah of the Quran is not like a chapter in a book. So I don't like the translation Surah 1, Surah 2, Surah 3 as chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3 like that. Because chapters, by definition, have a certain logic that everybody's familiar with. A chapter 3 means it's built on the ideas presented in chapter 2, right? And it depends on them in some way. And if chapter 3 is going to need something that is going to be mentioned again from chapter 2, it won't mention the whole thing again. It'll just make a quick reference and then move forward, right? So that's, by definition, chapters are chronological and they have a certain developmental order. So you cannot start a book and go to chapter 85 if you haven't read the first 84 chapters. It doesn't make any sense. But in the Quran, you know that even kids know قُلْ هُوَ اللَّهُ أَحَدٌ اللَّهُ الصَّمَدُ at the end of the Quran, or إِنَّا أَعْطَيْنَاكَ الْكَوْثَرَ at the end of the Quran. And even though those are the final chapters in the order of the Quran, they're not dependent on earlier material, right? So it doesn't really fit the definition of chapter. Surahs have their own unique identity. The other thing is inside a chapter. That's just the chronology of chapters. But even inside a chapter, you're supposed to have a progression of ideas. So you're supposed to have, some kind of one subject that one chapter deals with, right? And then if you wanted to have multiple topics, then you would turn them into multiple chapters. That's what you would do. What happens often in the Quran is you will have one surah, but the surah might have 20 topics. It might have 15 topics. It might have 8 different topics. It doesn't feel like a chapter. It almost feels like a book by itself. Even it feels on its own like an entire book. And even then, understanding why are these different topics, why are they all together in this way? Why is this being called a surah? So I'm not using the word chapter anymore. I'm using the word surah. So the surah has its own logic. It's not the same as the logic you find in books and chapters and poetry and other kinds of literature. It's its own unique standard. And one of the mistakes we make in studying the Quran is when we say, well, because you're used to reading books in literature, in poetry, stories, novels, science books, mathematics books, physics books, whatever books you're reading and whatever subject you're reading, they have a certain structure and a certain order, right? Our minds are built and programmed to process information that way. And we bring those expectations to the Quran. And then the Quran does not meet those expectations, clearly. And then it starts feeling like the Quran is unorganized. That because it doesn't follow the logic that we're used to, it looks like it's unorganized. And 2 things happened in our history. One thing that happened in our history is our scholars, they started accepting that idea. Many of them accepted the idea that the Quran is actually not really logically organized. There's no point in exploring why is it organized this way. Let's just study each ayah as a lesson from Allah, and the next ayah as the next lesson from Allah, and the next ayah as the next lesson from Allah. And sometimes we can see that this ayah is connected to this ayah, and we can describe the connection. Sometimes we cannot see the connection. It seems like it's completely disconnected. And there, you'll find that many scholars won't even discuss what just happened. They'll just say, now Allah is talking about this, but not say, why is He talking about this? I wonder what happened here? Why did the subject change all of a sudden? Even as an English reader of the translation of the Quran, you might notice a very abrupt, shocking change in subject immediately without warning. And you can feel it. You can feel something just shifted, and it's actually meant to almost disturb the reader. Because the flow, like when you're listening to recitation of the Quran, right, it has a flow, right? It's just, especially a good reciter, they're reciting the Quran and there's this endless, continuous flow. You just want them to keep on reciting, right? But then when you're reading the translation, you're like, this is very cut up. This is very disjointed. So it actually doesn't seem like it has a flow.